Now, when we start thinking about this issue of spiritual formation, the first thing we realize is we're really talking about transformation. I mentioned earlier that spiritual formation happens to everyone. No matter who they are or where they are, we all get one. The problem is that it is universally one that hurts us, that is not directed to reality. You see, when you think about Jesus, you have to think of him as someone who comes to teach us about reality. And the reality of the human soul is a part of that. So where we start from is, to speak colloquially, we're already in a mess. We don't start from point one, we start from point minus something in life, and we have to be straightened out. And it's so important for us to understand exactly what the problem is. I had a man call me at my office to ask after the 9/11 event, what is evil? And isn't it interesting that we have a hard time coming to grips with that or even admitting it in ourselves as well as in others? What is the problem with the human being? Basically, it is a problem of misperceiving who is God. Who is God? And the fundamental problem is perhaps best put by what is the thing that I am properly most concerned about, most needy to trust in, to think rightly about. And in the human situation, it always starts with us. We come into a world in which we experience threat and danger and evil, and instead of trusting God, we decide that we have to become the ones who is in charge. And now that's a failing enterprise because we're not in charge. We're amazingly weak. Our minds are so very small that God had to give us feelings and desires to run our life for the most part because our minds can't stay on top of it. I mean, just imagine if all of your eating was done by thinking. You had to think about eating in order to do it. You don't have to think about eating in order to do it, do you? I mean, you have something that prompts you, and God has helped us by giving us a wonderful range of good desires that direct us in our lives. We don't have to run by thought. We have feeling. We have a world around us to guide us. But the problem is, what is the center of that world? And that's where what we call the fall comes in. The fall turns us in on ourselves. You see, the question that was put in the garden was, why don't you try this out? You know, God is really not looking after you. And here's something that's real good, and probably he's trying to keep it from you. See, that's the form of all temptation. The form of all temptation is to take charge of things that I'm not really ultimately in charge of. Now, we're given a kingdom. All of us have a kingdom or a queendom of our own, and that's the range of our effective will, and God has made that. But he made it in such a way that it only works if we are subordinate to his kingdom. And once we withdraw from his kingdom and turn in ourselves, the first thing we start in doing is putting ourselves above the kingdoms of others. You know? Being willing to use others for our sake and to harm others, and perhaps generating so much evil that we even rejoice in seeing others harmed. I'm often deeply touched when I see what happens to young people when they become married and they're so in love, and then to see what happens as they go along and they grow alienated from one another and start attacking one another. And I know that by experience. I look back at it and I say, how could I have been so stupid? Well, I was focused on myself. There's a simple answer to it. And self-deification is really the form that this always takes. And then, especially as it progresses, it always turns to sensuality. And that's why sex and violence is such a huge presence in human life. is because it is working with the domination of my world through my body, and my body is the primary source of my power and my satisfaction. And so the whole sad story that you see in Romans 1, where Paul talks about the degradation of the human self when it turns away from the knowledge of God, comes out of that need to be in control. The greatest threat to the kingdom of God in my life is my kingdom. That's the one. And now He's made it so that I can do that. I can actually resist Him for a while, at any rate. But it all goes downhill when we do that. And we see that in our churches. The sad stories that you hear from our churches. I remember one church, a minister there was telling me how in 36 years they'd gone through 4 pastors, all of whom fell apart either on sex or money or something like that. And you almost you're almost waiting to see when it's going to happen, the way things stack up. And it isn't just ministers, of course. And it's worse outside the church than it is inside the church, because there are just no resources in life generally for handling this. And see, this is what does it mean to be lost in a situation like this? Well, it really means to not know where you are. See, when you focus on yourself, you lose your bearings. If you focus on God and you in the context of it, you can know where you are. See, a person is lost when they don't know. If you don't know where you are, you can't even use a map, because you can't find out where to start in the map. And that's what it really means to be lost. It means also to be outside of the kind of context in which we have a use. It means to be useless. If your keys are lost, they're useless, aren't they? And a human being who is lost is useless to God. And it's well that we should fear being lost and understand it. The day is not past when there are lost people. There are still lost people. And we have to be able to show them a way to Christ and through Christ to God that we ourselves are following, and we're experiencing the redemption that comes to the whole life. And when we do that, then they can have a light to follow, a reality to trust other than themselves.
Well, and I think that the lostness word is such a powerful one. And so often people think of it, I used to think of it primarily as meaning the same thing as hellbound. The primary categories of life are hellbound and heavenbound, and you're one or the other.
Until then, have a good time.
Because that's going to be it.
Yeah.
But, I think about, Dallas, you were talking earlier about the notion of the importance of dissatisfaction in spiritual life. And that a lot of what motivates someone to seek for the kingdom is when you finally get dissatisfied with life outside of it. And I had been a Christian for a long time, but really reached the point where I felt like, I don't think I'm honestly changing. I think I'm struggling to have a quiet time on a regular basis, and I am avoiding the kind of sins that Baptists avoid. But am I genuinely becoming a more loving person or a more joyful person? Am I getting more humorous and sensible and strong? No.
Would you be willing to share where that, and I don't know the answer to this question at all, what are some of the specifics that created a disappointment that was healthy, that led to a spiritual formation, whatever the word means?
For a long time, it led primarily to a sense of disappointment and stagnation and guilt. Disappointment because I felt like I've invested my whole life in this thing.
And this is after being a Christian for a number of years.
After being a pastor for a
number of years.
Be sued for malpractice or something. Stagnation because I think that's probably just part of life. Anytime you feel like you're not growing, there's a dissatisfaction built into that.
But what made you aware of that? And most people.
You know, one of the things that triggered it was being a pastor, and somebody asked me, they were talking about how prayer was always a struggle for them. And what should I do with that?
Your job was to instruct them into the kind of prayer life that you had.
I can remember writing to them about a quote from C.S. Lewis in Letters to Malcolm, where he talks about maybe our prayers that mean the most to God are the ones that we offer when we're feeling dry. So I wrote about that, but I remember even when I wrote about that saying, but you know what, there has to be more than dryness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so there was a long period for me of, I think it was just being willing to acknowledge
the true state of your soul.
Yeah, which was hard for one thing because I was a Christian, because I'd always been in a Christian family, because doing well spiritually was important, because being a prodigal son was never really an option.
Yeah.
I couldn't let go of the
Yeah.
rope.
Yes.
And now I was a pastor. And
you have such wonderful parents. I understand that fully.
And
plus, your living depended on being a nice.
Yeah, my paycheck
Christian.
was connected to it, all kinds of stuff. So for a long time, it was very much a private thing, I would say, just an internal sadness.
You know, a lot I can remember as a young pastor how dissatisfied I was.
Yeah.
Because I knew that much more was supposed to be happening under my ministry. Now that was outward directed. I wasn't very much aware of myself. And just the feeling that for me, also Baptist, winning souls, getting converts was that was the top. That's the top. And I just knew that I was grinding it out. There was no flow in it. There was no life-giving freshness to it.
Yeah.
So I get another convert.
Yeah.
Right? And actually the verse that hounded me was the verse in Matthew where Jesus says, you compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you've got him, you make him twofold more the child of hell than you yourselves are.
Had a blaster approach, didn't it?
Could be a life verse for a lot of people.
Well, I'll tell you.
It should be a life
get to
verse for a lot of
thinking
people.
about it. And what I realized was just the effort and being clever and not growing, but finding devices for getting results and things
Maneuvering,
of that sort.
manipulating,
And
strategizing.
All in a
think-
good cause.
All in a good cause.
This is another one of those
And
steps.
justifies a means.
Another one of those steps be real helpful to people. I think for me, trying to achieve something was always important and was partly a way of evading this gnawing internal sense of dissatisfaction. So if something went well, if I achieved something, if a talk went well, if I wrote something and it was well received, then it was like
okay
there'd
for
be
a time.
bursts attached to that.
That's called an addiction.
Yeah, it is, and it could be on the achievement level. It could be in a number of different areas of life, sexual or relational, or a number of them. And I think to get to the point of saying, I want to put that on the shelf and just look at, am I satisfied with my life, with the state of my heart, and the state of my experience with God? How is that really? But that requires getting alone, putting a lot of other things aside, and
Some
facing
silence,
a
some
level of
solitude.
unpleasantness that is very difficult to face. And that, my world was a noisy world. So it wasn't just things inside me that inclined me not to do that. It was pace of life and television and busyness and lots of other things that I had to kind of put aside and allow the pain to speak loud enough to say, I'm not satisfied.
So we can make the assumption that every human being, when they're honest, will sense this vacuum, will sense this disappointment, this dissatisfaction. Isn't that the Romans 8 groaning idea, that until we're complete in heaven, there's always going to be something that impels us further on? And I wonder if sometimes, as you say that you move toward an interest in pursuing God more richly by a recognition of your own emptiness and the gnawing pain that you were covering with clutter and busyness and success spiritually, whatever. God sometimes, it seems to me, in His mercy, that doesn't look like mercy, allows difficult things to put us in touch with our level of emptiness.
Oh, yeah.
Allows failure. Your success when you wrote a good book or had a good sermon and people said, "Well, John, you're incredible," then you filled that hole for a time, but never permanently, obviously. I know in my own experience, probably the two major things were our older son's rebellion. 5 years of rebellion where we were terrified that he was going to kill himself. When he was, and this is said with his permission, by the way, When he was expelled from a Christian university, he went to Taylor University, which I was told was the place to go because it was 50 miles from the nearest sin. And it wasn't 50 miles. It's a great school, but there's sinners there. Yeah, a little bit. And when he was expelled from school, I had to say that I was feeling good about myself as a parent for a long time because I did it right.
Yeah.
I mean, for family devotions, I purchased an overhead projector.
Oh my gosh.
Can you guys get any more spiritual than that?
Holy smokes.
I never heard of this.
Yeah. No. I had an Old Testament survey, New Testament survey. My kids could define propitiation at age 6. You know, and these kids were going to be godly, and I was going to see to it, and God was going to cooperate with my agendas. But when all that happened, I was humbled into a recognition that I'm not sufficient. And that was huge for me. The other one, I'll just mention really quickly to you guys, is my brother's death in the plane crash. 2 weeks after he died, I said to my wife, after all the services and the immediate details were taken care of, I said to my wife, midnight, went to bed, and I said, I can't sleep tonight. There are tears I have not yet shed. I don't know what they are. And I got up, and I went to my study, got my Bible, and didn't know where to turn. I was looking for answers, you know, why, God, tell me why, and I didn't get anything like that in the scriptures at all. But I finally, with tears that were convulsive, there were sobs. I think it was the Hosea 7 where he said, I long to redeem you, but I can't so long as you wail on your bed. But when you cry from your heart, and I've been wailing in my bed, but now I was crying from my heart, and what I said to God, I'll never forget the words. The words were these: I know you're all I have, but I don't know you well enough for you to be all that I need. And then it was, Lord, let me find you. And that was the next level of commitment or resolve or intention as we talk about the
And Larry, as you talk about wailing on my bed, but I wasn't crying from my heart, what was the difference?
I think that a lot of us cry over our pain in a way that represents little more than a complaint.
We just want the pain to stop.
Stop the pain. God, that's your job. And if you don't do your job, then I have every right to go to some resource that will do the job better, be it alcohol, pornography, whatever. And that's crying from that's wailing on your bed, in my understanding, just a complaint against God, because now that I'm a Christian, your job is to make my life go better. And when you don't cooperate, then I'll go elsewhere. And crying from your heart, I think, is just a recognition of, Dallas, what you talk about, I think, so effectively, just personal lostness. And this is not something that once a person's saved, they're not lost, but my goodness, we still struggle with some kind of a reality of, is there, am I in line with the kingdom? Am I living out the life of Jesus? And when the answer is no, then you realize that there's just an emptiness within you that you can go no place but God. And then you realize you're not going to God as kind of a manipulative, I'm empty, fill me, although there's something right about that because he's the source of fullness. But there's just a rightness about it. God, you're it. You're perfect. You're glorious. And I want to get to know you better. And I do believe that the benefit of that will be that there will be joy, there will be love, there will be peace. But I'm not going to require that in the timetable because this is the right thing to do. It's what my heart cries for.